Thank you for letting me present today. And I'm presenting on behalf of myself and one of my students. And we're going to talk about how cities and civilizations produce and sustain their food supplies, as this is a fundamental factor in their survival. Now, the nature of food supply in the face of changing climate and social conditions has been much debated, and diversity is a key factor often highlighted in sustainability. Halstead and O'Shea have noted that food surplus and supply are critical to risk mitigation. Decisions related to diversity, speciality, yield, and integration of agricultural systems are all theorised as having influenced how urban centres were supplied, maintained, and how they weathered the challenges thrown at them by social and climatic shifts. However, the nuances of different demands, be those yield, surplus, trade, risk mitigation, within a culture during a short-term moment of stress, and the long-term and far-reaching implications of this, are often overlooked. So the Indus is a region of vast diversity, both culturally but also ecologically. We've got two rainfall systems, two rivers, numerous ecological habitats, and gradients from arid through to semi-tropical climate zones. And within that, it's unsurprising that we have a great diversity in agricultural strategies. But during the decline of the Indus, starting around about 2100 BC through really ramping up at 1900 BC and beyond, the role of agricultural production and shifts in strategies has been highly debated. There we go. So, as noted, the Indus is covering this vast, diverse region, but what we see during the Late Harappan period is a real change. So larger monumental architectural features are beginning to decline, fall out of use. We've got changes in craft specialisation, for example, technological virtuosity is shifting, and we've got the decline, depopulation, or reduced population of urban centres, and also settlement reorientation, so people moving away from large conurbations to smaller villages. And the idea of how agriculture fits into this has been very often theorised. So an idea of an agricultural revolution is something that's been traditionally brought in as accompanying these changes. Food supply is often highlighted as a driver or effect of climate change. And in the Indus in particular, it's linked in with ideas of the 4.2K event. So this is broadly to be described as an abrupt and severe arid phase beginning around 4.2 KYA, and it lasts anywhere between a century to several centuries. The argument for agriculture as a critical component of this is that changes in water supply lead to new agricultural practices or crops, and this in turn leads to new socio-economic relationships. This destabilizes the system, causing or at least exacerbating the decline of the Indus. And we see this as a model that's mirrored in many works, so for example, Meadow, Weber, Medela, and Fuller. But the correlation and causation of agriculture and socioeconomic changes and the 4.2K event are problematic. Within agricultural studies of the Indus, there is a growing recognition of the diversity inherent in the system. So we have to ask ourselves, is it really logical to suggest that a single agricultural shift really reflects the complexity of the Indus, of the Late Harappan period, and any possible impact of a 4.2K event? So what this paper is going to focus on instead is how agricultural diversity in relation to food supply strategies and choices can be hypothesized. We're trying to move the conversation in a new direction towards farmer agency, towards resilience and sustainability debates, rather than thinking about collapse and/or revolution angles that have dominated, even if implicitly, most of our narratives. So there are many decisions that farmers can make in regards to their fields and crops. Some of these relate to the environment. Crops can grow within very specific ecological niches that allow them to grow. This can, however, be altered, manipulated by human strategies to increase the yield, and this is done through improving the growth conditions. For example, we can change the soil fertility, we can improve the water supply, we can change the soil structure. And this is where we have to start thinking about decisions around intensification, to alter the economic outcome of the agricultural strategy. Intensification is a very specific concept, and in agricultural discussions, it relates to the increase in crop yield per unit of land, and it has many different forms. The two that we're interested in discussing here are specialization and diversification. They're not exactly the same as diversity and speciality, and that's important to note. If we're thinking about specialization, this might mean the overall narrowing of a range of resources or systems of growing things. Diversification is the opposite. It's the increase in resources or the increase in strategies of growing things. So Wright, for example, gives the use of perennials alongside crops as an example of diversification, or the focusing in on just annuals as specialization. Diversity and speciality might be the result of a varying intensification strategy. So the process towards a diverse cropping assemblage could be the result of diversification, but it could also be the result of specialization. And I know that sounds a bit strange. So to give you the example, we have some beans, quite a lot of different beans. But if, say, for example, you decide to specialize, so your specialization process is to focus in on beans, you could grow lots of different kinds of beans, and you have in fact specialized over time and got quite a diverse range of beans. But at the same time, if you decided to diversify out and focus on growing both perennials and annuals all the way around, you could end up with, again, another diverse assemblage with lots of different things. So we're thinking here about two separate outcomes. Specialization and diversification are processes, diversity and speciality are outcomes. So that's worth bearing in mind. There's a bit of technical stuff here, and I'm not going to go into the full details of how all of this works and how we figure it all out, because we'd need to go into weed ecologies and other things. What's interesting in regards to all of this is Harris. So Harris talks a lot about the idea of speciality and diversity and specialization and diversification in a paper on the divergence between tropical and cereal-based agricultural origins. And I know this sounds a bit far-fetched for the Indus, but it is quite useful. He contrasts the idea of a short-term but high-yield strategy of cereals versus the long-term stability of vegiculture, which you get in a lot of tropical places. And he suggests that the importance, or the implications rather, of relying on a one-stop source for carbohydrates, proteins and fats that we get from a cereal system is very different versus the sheer necessity of diversifying your strategy when you're relying on vegiculture, where you have to use roots and tubers and other things and get a diverse assemblage out of it. And he says we can model this and think about it in terms of the economic implications. And he suggests that there's a couple of equations. You've got vegiculture or mixed taxa versus a cereal or grain dominant system. If we simplify this, we could say it's diversity versus monoculture. And the outcome of this is a low versus a high yield. And when you think about this in terms of economic food supply systems, you could say that we've got flexibility versus supply, but the flip side of this is that it's stability versus instability. And this gives farmers a lot of different things to think about. So if we distill this down, you might end up with a very diverse system that has a large range of taxa that gives you a low supply but has a very stable outcome to it. But on the other hand, you might have a very specialized cropping system that has a small range of taxa, high supply, but is very unstable. So the differences in diversity and speciality, polyculture, monoculture, low and high yield, flexibility and supply are critical to society and the decisions that farmers are making. And they affect not only those producing, but those perhaps demanding and also using those agricultural products. And it's this angle this paper is taking, thinking not solely about environmentally driven understandings of agricultural production, but also questions about specialization and diversification, speciality and diversity, and also supply and demand, incorporating those economic and agentative choices made by farmers and the impacts of those outcomes during the shifts. So taking a couple of examples, we'll start with Harappa, where we have to feed an urban site. Weber and colleagues argued that large grain cereals played a vital role in the rise of urban centres in the Indus. Large grains, mainly the rabi crops, wheat and barley, played a critical role, not necessarily for their nutritional value, but for their production methods, the fact that they are high-yielding crops. So they were hypothesized by Weber and colleagues to allow for large populations to mass together in large settlements, encouraging that urbanization process and urban support. Now, we could critique perhaps problems of equating site size with site function. People like Petrie and others have done this, but it's really important to think about the role of cereal agricultural intensity in supporting cities during periods of change, as Weber and others have done. So one of the things that has been noted before by people like Hayden and Kelly are that there are numerous factors for urban population growth, but Weber's study really serves to remind us that large cereals like wheat and barley are thought to have been really critical for food supply. And when we look at Harappa, we can really see this. Barley is the dominant crop during the early Harappan period, wheat in the mature Harappan period, and barley again in the late Harappan period. We see increasing presence of kharif crops, mainly millets, but at no point do they represent more than 7% of the assemblage. So there is a small increase of diversity, as Weber argues, but it really isn't very much at all. It's not going to have been significant. Now, this monoculture of rabi suggests that demand for yield is highly important. And this is an area that is driven more by the rabi season, by that winter season. But it suggests to us that rather than thinking about a diverse strategy during the winter season, they're really thinking about focusing in on cereal monocropping, large grain cereals to supply the urban population. Over time, we might argue that this focus on supply versus flexibility would not have been that useful, because when you get into the late Harappan period, we're seeing how instability in the environmental system and perhaps economic upheaval created a tension around Harappa. We see them trying to respond to it by increasing the millets in the system, but that balance between flexibility and urban supply doesn't play out very well for the site, and we see them having to keep supplying wheat and barley, and it just doesn't weather the 4.2K event very well. Now, we don't have any other urban sites to play with at the moment for data, so we have no idea really how it's working out at places like Mohenjo-Daro and other sites, so we're very reliant on Harappa. If we look to other regions, though, we have some other interesting strategies to contrast it with. There's been a lot of older models that create core and periphery and argue that in the core areas around Harappa it's all wheat and barley, and other areas it's all kharif, and this is very problematic now that we know how diverse the agricultural system in the Indus is. If we look at Gujarat, we do see a trend towards kharif cropping, and this could be argued to relate very much to the environment, but also if we think about who is creating the supply and demand. In this region we have a rainfall between June and September, that's the Indian summer monsoon, and it does shape the agricultural and pastoral activities. Prolonged drought is a recurrent phenomenon, particularly in the arid areas in North Gujarat and Kutch. At the site of Rojdi, we see a dominance of small millets. These are very arid adapted and suited to the environment. But there are other crops incorporated into this. It's a kharif strategy that is flexible in the sense that they are building in other kharif crops alongside the millets. And that flexibility goes towards things like their intercropping and duoculture of multiple diverse millet taxa. So we have Lucane, Panicum miliari, Soteria glauca, Soteria italica. This is a system that is flipping backwards and forwards between different kharif millets and other little kharif crops to try and make the best of what they've got. So it's focused on the single season predominantly, but they're playing around with a complex millet system to try and make the best of it, to be flexible around it, using things like Maslin systems. We see this also at places like Surkotada and Babakot. But in Gujarat, we have more than just a monolith. It's a pattern that is not just singular across the region. And we see it playing out at places like Kisara and Kanma, where other demands on the cropping system, other than ecology and environment, are changing the way in which farmers think about their strategies. So, for example, at Kisara, we see early Harappan 90% barley, very similar to the monocropping in Harappa. It's counter the environment of the area. It suggests that perhaps there is a demand from other urban sites being placed on it, outstripping the ecological adaptations. Over time, this breaks down a little bit. There is only 49% in barley in the mature Harappan period. Other kharif crops are introduced, but this isn't necessarily the millets. We've got things like the beans, we've got dura crops of rice being added in. And by the late Harappan period, it's a very diverse system. We've got pearl millet, we've got rice, we've got grape millet being added in, but we've still got the barley in there. So it's not a solely cereal-based system, we've got the pulses as well. And we're seeing this happening at Kanma. So we've got Kisara, Kanma, Rojdi, Surkotada, all of these different systems showing us great flexibility, and that's really indicative of Gujarat. Different demands are changing the way these sites are interacting, some of them being more ecological, some of them thinking more about their economic. And we can see this coming across in other aspects, for example, trade. We know that this is a very dry and climatically unpredictable region, perhaps the least climatically predictable region of the Indus. It seems unlikely that settlements in this region would have survived without trade, and we know that they were very much engaged with the wider Indus economy. So, for example, despite being not on the coast, Kisara maintained a shell workshop. We see this at other places as well, different workshops occurring. So we could argue that perhaps the Rabi cropping was part of an elaborate trade system that breaks down towards the end of the mature Harappan period, when either Rabi trade breaks down, or when the Rabi supply system is just not needed anymore. And this idea then perhaps links in with how they're thinking about their own systems. Maybe Kisara just decides it doesn't want to be involved in the Rabi trade and to focus more on their own ecological needs. So it might not just be the demand, it could be that the supply dries up. So unlike Harappa, it's a flexible system in Gujarat, one that is willing to completely shift seasonal focus away from cereal monocultures as the variables change. If we look to the northeast, another area that's so-called periphery, we see a very different strategy from Gujarat and again from Harappa. Places like Masudpur, Bahola, Dabivas Chugta use a complex overlap of winter and summer cropping, all linked into the microenvironments of the landscape. This is a real feature, this idea of sequential cropping, mixed monocultures, duo and polycultures, different kinds of intercropping, all to be really flexible around their local microenvironment. There's no chronological patterning to any shifts seen in the intensification systems. So this is very different again from what we've seen in other areas, and I'm not going to go into the full details. What we do have, though, are some questions remaining as to who is supplying food to the nearby city of Rakhigarhi, because we don't see any nice chronological shifts as we've got at places like Kisara, where we see evidence of supply and demand playing out in that nice pattern of barley change. At our sites here in the northeast, we have very clear crop processing evidence of a lack of food supply outside of the villages. So who's feeding this city of Rakhigarhi? Are they also relying on wheat and barley like Harappa, or are they playing with a flexible strategy like the villagers? These are questions that we need to think about, especially in relation to Rakhigarhi's sustainability and survival. So some of the implications we can think about are in relation to how climate unpredictability might have played out when we've got different senses of demand being placed on it, both environmental and economic. Although Petrie has argued for unpredictable unpredictability, we might suggest that not everyone experienced this unpredictable unpredictability in the same way due to their choices. As explored in Weber, the idea of serial cities could have been especially important in the rise and maintenance of large urban populations. Stable surplus creation, while important for urban support, would have become unsustainable as a strategy during the 4.2K event. The over-reliance on Rabi crops, due to population size and the need to feed people, created a really inflexible system. And yes, there were millets added in, but it was too little too late. On the other hand, where we have well-published datasets in Gujarat and the northeast, we're seeing a very different set of outcomes for small sites because they seem to be a lot more flexible in what they're doing. For example, the kharif-focused millet use would have been suitable at certain moments for village subsistence, while wheat growing for interaction with cities allowed for more engagement with different economic networks during periods of stability. That flexibility allowed them to play with different demands. So what we can suggest then is that diversity versus monoculture, vegiculture, mixed taxa versus cereal and grain dominance, low and high yields, flexibility in supply, which we can build out of Harris and intensification theory, allows us some insights into the decisions being made by farmers and the consequences of those in the late Harappan period. Demand is something that we're still playing with. This is still an idea. But the uneven impacts of the late Harappan period may have partially, and I say partially because again, correlation and causation are problematic, but they may have partially been a result of different Indus agricultural economic choices, equations, and demands. So this is something we've been playing with, it's an idea, and we're just thinking about how the 4.2K event and social changes in the late Harappan period created a situation of population environmental stress, which could have put pressures on food production and supply chains, but this is not a monolithic stress across the Indus, both in terms of the environmental diversity already in place, the different impacts of the 4.2K event across the region, and the variations in the way that the choices that people were making in relation to demand, economic, social, and environmental. Farmers are agents, and this is something we need to incorporate into our thinking. And I want to stop there and say thank you to everyone that has given me ideas and helped me with this, and also to the organisers for inviting me to present and allowing me to do it by video. Thank you.